In this video, we will be working with soft contrast, giving this raw file this final look. As always, feel free to follow along by downloading this raw file from the link in the description of the video. And now let's begin. Alright, before we start with the fun stuff, of course we have to crop the image because we do have some heavy vignetting in the corners. So let's go into the cropping mode. I'm going to take a bit out from the top right here, the bottom, always making sure to keep the subject nicely centered. Alright, that's looking much better. You can see we still have a little bit of vignetting going on, but we can simply get rid of that. For that, let's go into the remove tool and use the remove mode. Make sure to use generative AI. And then I'm just going to brush over these darker corners. And hopefully Lightroom will fix that. So once I have targeted all four corners, just click on remove. Okay, and that's looking much better. Now we can start with the basic adjustments, and therefore let's expand the basic panel. Now, why does this raw file look so dark? I exposed this image in a way so I have all the details in those highlights without losing details in the very darkest parts of the image. You can see that looking at the histogram, I don't have any clipping in the highlights or in the shadows. So right out of the camera, that's a perfect exposure since we want to tweak things a little more with post-processing. I want to apply soft contrast for this scene because we have a nice warm sunset and I want to make this image look glowing. The very first thing I do is to change the profile. Now for soft contrast, usually I would go with Adobe Neutral, which you can see is a very flat profile, or maybe Adobe Standard. In this case, I want to push the colors a little more, so I'm choosing Adobe Landscape. This profile does come with a little more contrast, but I'm going to reduce it as we go on with the editing now. First off, let's make this shot brighter. And the best option here is to bring up the exposure, which will target all areas of the image, the brighter and the darker spots, and make them brighter. Looking at the histogram, you can see I can push the exposure quite a bit before running into issues, but of course I don't want to overdo it. I would say something like this looks pretty good. We still don't have clipping in the highlights as indicated by the histogram, but the sky is blown out and we kind of lose visible detail in here, which I don't like. To fix that problem, I'm going to tone down the highlights. Let's bring them down all the way until we have all the details back, and that's looking much better. And that's basically already the first step for this soft contrast look. Raising the exposure to make everything brighter and dropping the highlights to reduce the brightness in the brightest parts. At the same time, I'm going to bring up the blacks, making the darkest parts just a little brighter. And as I bring up those areas, this will help creating a softer looking image. Usually I do that for all my images because it just kind of emulates some kind of soft glow effect. Now, of course, we don't want to lose all that contrast, but we still have the shadows and the whites sliders. Now we can balance things a little more around these two sliders. I can carefully bring down the shadows, introducing a little more contrast this way as I make some of these darker areas darker. At the same time, I can bring up the whites to make some of the brighter areas brighter again. Okay, that's looking really good. And again, I'm paying close attention to the histogram just to keep things safe. But once more, there is no clipping in the darkest or the brightest areas, so that's looking really good. At this point, once I have done the tonal adjustments, I usually work on the white balance because after setting up these, I have a better idea of what the image looks like. So for me, this image is way too cold. I want this to look a lot warmer. So let's just bring up the temperature a bit and see what happens. So at this point, I think everything looks much better, especially if you take a look at the sand in the foreground, which has now a much more natural color. I'm also going to slightly raise the tint because I feel like this shot could use some more magenta tones like this. Alright, looking pretty good so far. Now we can fine-tune the global sharpness and contrast of the image some more using these sliders below. Usually I'm going to add a bit of texture, which will just make the details look sharper. Then clarity is for midtones contrast. So reducing it, we can reduce midtones contrast and add some kind of nice soft look on top of it, or we can bring it up and get out a little more details. For this image, I think I'm going to bring it up a little bit because it just works really well with the texture in the foreground. Now the dehaze slider also helps improving the contrast of this scene. Usually for the glowing effect I would bring down the dehaze. You can see how this further reduces the contrast, but what I'm going to do for this scene is I'm going to very gently bring it up, just kind of balancing the overall contrast. So right around here looks good to me. I'm not going to touch the vibrance or saturation sliders because I think the colors do look quite nice for the basic adjustments already. So that means we're done with the basic adjustments. Let's compare to before. And you can see a huge difference, especially when comparing the brightness of these images. The right side does look much softer already, and hopefully you can also see how this fits this whole landscape a lot better than this dark look on the left side. Now I want to focus on a few areas more locally, and as always we're going to do that with masking. So let's open up the masking panel right away and let me use a radial gradient with which I'm going to add a little bit of glow coming in from the left side. I'm going to make it quite big, but I'm making sure the center of this radial gradient lies outside of the image just to get a more natural effect. I'm also making sure I'm including the subject right here because I want to have some glow on this structure as well. And for the glow effect, all I'm doing is I'm reducing the contrast again in that bright spot. I can do that by bringing up the blacks, and I can also further reduce contrast, as I said before, by bringing down the dehaze. And this will help introducing a very convincing glow effect. Let's bring it down a little further. As we bring down the contrast in this area, another thing is we're losing colors in here. I want to change that. I'm going to use this little color box right here with which you can add a specific color tone to this area. So I want to make it a bit warmer again since we lost a bit of warmth due to these changes. Let's set up the hue somewhere around here in the orange color range, and I don't want to overdo it with the saturation, so let me pull it down a bit. That's looking pretty balanced. Another thing we can do, of course, is to use the temperature and tint slider to fine-tune things a little further. So I'm going to bring up the temperature, introducing more warmth, and I'm going to bring up the tint to add a little bit more magenta. And in combination, this will just give this area more of an orange color. Alright, perfect. I don't think there's much to do for the sky, but I want to fine-tune the foreground. So let me use a linear gradient and roughly cover the very near foreground like this. I want to bring out the texture in the sand. So the texture slider is perfect for that, making everything a little more detailed. I'm going to push it up a bit. If you want, you can also use the clarity slider, play around with it a bit. You could bring it up and kind of bring a little more attention to that plant in the foreground. In this case, what I want to do is I want to bring it down. I'm going to reduce the midtones contrast, and this will help further introducing a very subtle glow effect in the foreground. So somewhere around -5 should be great. Alright, I'm quite happy with this image already, but I do feel like I need to target the whole landscape in the foreground. Let's use a landscape mask for that. In here, I want to choose the natural ground. You can see how this will nicely target all the sand in the foreground like I want to. Let's click on Create Mask, and thanks to the overlay, I can actually see some areas which need a little more tweaking. I'm going to subtract a brush, and I'm just going to get rid of a few areas right here, but that's about it. Now, with this setup, what I want to do is to make use of the tone curve. The tone curve is really powerful when it comes to contrast. You have a lot more precise controls than using the tonal adjustment sliders. So let me turn off the overlay. I feel like the darkest parts of the sand in the foreground could use a little more brightness. Therefore, I can pick the point for the blacks and just slightly drag it up. Of course, the whole contrast shifts a little bit too much, so I'm going to create another control point right around here, some in the darker shadows, and let me pull it down just a little bit. Doing this, we will lose brightness again, so I'm going to create a point somewhere in the middle, and let's bring back some brightness for the midtones. Not too much. If we overdo it in the tone curve, this will look quite obvious quite fast. So I want to keep it subtle as always. And I could use another point for the brighter highlight somewhere around here. and just tickle out a little more brightness like this. Now let me deactivate the tone curve so we can see what's happening from before to after. Using the tone curve, we added some much nicer contrast in a very subtle way to the foreground. So one more thing I want to do, I want to slightly change the colors a bit. What I mean by that is I'm going to bring up the white balance temperature for the foreground, giving the sand more of a yellowish color, just making it look a bit more natural this way. Of course, this is way too saturated, so I'm going to tone down the saturation as well. Perfect. We could also bring down the tint because the sand does have a very purple color cast, so I'm just balancing things this way. Perfect. One more thing I want to do, let's create a new landscape mask. This time I'm going to target the vegetation, so basically this bush right here in the foreground. Again, I'm going to create mask and subtract a brush to clean up everything else which I don't need. Just want to have this thing in the foreground. And I want to add a little more contrast specifically on this thing, giving this whole shot a little more depth. So I'm going to bring up the whites, which will make this thing brighter. And I'm also going to use some extra highlights to further brighten up this thing. Maybe I could bring down the tint, introducing some more natural green tones in it, but that's about it. And there we have the image after the masking adjustments. Let me turn off all the masks to see the difference from before to after. Masking on this image does have a very subtle effect, but comparing it you can see how it nicely creates this soft contrast look I'm aiming for this scene. Next up, let's do a bit of color grading. And I'm going to skip over the color mixer. I want to head straight into the color grading panel. Here I just want to target the highlights and I want to further introduce warmth to this image by using a warm color tone somewhere around here. And of course we need to bring up the saturation so this effect becomes visible. I don't want to make it too strong, but I think something around 20 looks perfect. And finally, let's also go down into the calibration tab. And as usual for my images, I'm going to bring down the blue primary hue, which will shift the blue tones, but also the warmer color tones of this image. And I'm going to bring up the saturation some more like this. Beautiful. Now the only thing left to do, of course, the sharpening in the details panel. Let's do that. I'm going to bring down the radius, increase the details, hold down the Alt key while applying some masking to only target the important areas. And let's bring up the amount of sharpening. And we are done editing this image. So I hope you will find some use for this soft contrast look. And as always, if you have questions left, let me know in the comments. I will try to answer them as quickly as possible. Thank you so much for watching and see you all next time.